Well, welcome back. Thank you so much, Mary and Andrew. We're missing Harrison today, but thank you for being with us again.
You're welcome.
Pleasure.
What is PTSD and what are some misconceptions from a professional point of view? Mary?
Right. The word trauma is thrown around a lot, but to actually get diagnosed with PTSD, there are some particular criteria you have to meet. So you actually have to experience one or more traumatic events. And it's sort of beyond the norm type of events. And but it doesn't become PTSD, with D standing for disorder, unless the symptoms last for longer than 30 days. And so some of the symptoms would be like recurring flashbacks, dreams, intense psychological distress if they're exposed to something that reminds them of that trauma. There can often be loss of memory for some aspects of their trauma, but then having really, really detailed memories for things that are not even relevant to it, like smells or certain colors. There's a huge avoidance strategy. They don't want to think about the thoughts or the experiences, the emotion. They just want to shut it all down. And often a hypervigilant, exaggerated startle response. These are all the things that we start to see when people are experiencing PTSD. Now, with some of the misconceptions is that I can just white knuckle my way through. When I put it aside, I'm not thinking about it. I'm not even thinking about it. I'm fine. And that's sort of the common response. Right. The other one for people who are frontline workers who are regularly exposed to vicarious trauma. So it may not have happened to them, but they're responding to people with traumatic events. It begins to wear on them. Mm-hmm. And there is the misconception that I can just keep being exposed to this and I will be okay. Right. And I'll just push through it. And unfortunately, that's not how trauma works. In fact, if trauma is kind of tucked in the brain and you don't have a chance to process it, if you can picture like this garbage bin where everything's shoved in there and these leaky toxins start to come out, and it affects the way you react, it affects your health, it affects the way you see things. People will tend to have a bit more of a negative, cynical worldview, and you actually end up becoming less able to do the job that you love doing because all of these effects are happening and they're not being dealt with.
Wow, that is super helpful. Andrew, any other thoughts on that?
I just want to tag on to the whole idea of unprocessed experiences. Sometimes we defend, we guard against them by not going there, but that is the way through it. We've got to go through it to come out on the other side, and we don't need to do it alone. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the challenge as well. We haven't had experiences with helpful guides to be with us, to be still in those moments where we would rather run, to learn that we can tolerate it. Physically, we've survived, right? But there's a part of us that gets to come awake and alive to that strength and that resilience so that we can move through and process it, because our worldview is changed. Right. Something has happened. And we've internalized this meaning about whatever it is has happened. Right. And unless we explore and discover that and then rewrite that, we'll forever live with that meaning and that idea, right, when in fact that might not be entirely true.
Wow, that's really, really helpful. So, there's a lot of financial hardship. So maybe PTSD isn't always about, we often associate that with those who have gone to war, in a sense, or been through terribly traumatic experiences. But we're seeing financial hardship. Can we have PTSD as a result of that? And even pandemic hardship? What would that look like? Andrew, what do you think?
Yes, I know trauma is a word that we kind of throw around a lot. I think there's a reality that experiences that we have, they're so personal. So the way that one event impacts one person, it may impact another person in a completely different way. So the idea of being in a situation where you're not going to be able to fend for yourself or take care of yourself, it's really easy to those thoughts to kind of spiral that, I'll never be able to recover. I'll never be able to take care of my family. And that's a very, very difficult place to live. Feeling that sense, a loss of power and a loss of control, it's really difficult to sit with. It really is.
Yeah, and that can be a form of trauma. Mary, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, a trauma actually is a overarching description of a number of different ways that people respond to traumatic or stress responses. So there's a diagnosis called adjustment disorder, and that would probably be the one that would be the formal term that we use to describe somebody who's going through financial hardship. So it's almost like their system can no longer cope with the enormity of the stress that they're dealing with, and it causes psychological and physical harm to the person who's going through that. So it's not the formal diagnosis of PTSD, but it really does look a lot like it.
Yeah, interesting. What's your advice to people working in the front lines of this pandemic? You touched on this, Mary, earlier, and possibly experiencing what we might call compassion fatigue. Maybe we'll need to define that term. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
I think so many of people, well, they're in the helping profession.
Yeah.
It's part of their DNA to be helpful. And a lot of the times there's no off switch to that. And we don't give ourselves permission to take care of ourselves.
Yeah.
And just because you leave work doesn't mean that work leaves you. So it's important to have ways to take care of yourself.
Right.
I know the demand. My wife is a frontline worker and was supporting. She's a nurse, so she was supporting people, and especially when it was just happening and nobody really knew how you could really contract it, and what was safe and what wasn't.
Right.
In addition to trying to help people, is that fear and concern that I'm vulnerable. I'm vulnerable. So finding ways to acknowledge that and to take care of ourselves is important.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily have good healthcare self-care practices where we withdraw, and we talked about this earlier in the week, where we rejuvenate ourselves, where we
Yeah.
rest. It's very difficult, but it's very important to have those things.
Well, compassion fatigue. I mean, these people on the front lines that are serving others. Mary, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, people who enter the field of any type of interaction with people and you're caring for people, responding to their needs, typically enter because they genuinely want to help people. They're full of compassion and empathy. So some of the best people in the fields are actually going to be more susceptible to compassion fatigue because you're out there and you're giving and you're giving. And what happens is that it's not a perpetually flowing bucket of compassion that we have. Eventually it starts to dry out and it becomes difficult. Some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue are when you almost start to become flatline in your emotions. You start to kind of want to run away if somebody with more needs comes along. You can have a more cynical viewpoint. You can feel depressed. And the challenge with that is people who are compassionate by nature, they will experience those symptoms and beat themselves up and think, oh, no, I just have to try harder. What's wrong with me? All to love people. Those are all the things that can make it very difficult. So the response is to be able to go, I am human. I am finite in how much I can give. Yeah. And if my body's starting to tell me that I'm starting to have compassion fatigue, I need to slow things down. I need to take care of myself, all the things like Andrew said. Yeah. And so there are, we could even put onto the 700 Club website some different questionnaires that people can fill out that can help them determine what their level of compassion fatigue is, burnout, vicarious trauma. And I would suggest that frontline workers check yourself regularly, make sure you're doing okay.
Well, that's really helpful advice, and we'll be right back with more.